Good evening, everybody. Just going to give a little bit of time here for people to get into the room, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, I'm going to get started with, I believe that probably most of you who are on this webinar this evening are familiar with One Health, particularly One Health at Del Val. But for those of you who may be new or have forgotten what One Health is, I'll give you my definition of it. And the definition down at the bottom of this page is one definition, but my definition is pretty simplistic. Um, we got one planet. We're all living on this planet together. We interact with each other in positive or negative ways. And whatever is happening to one element of this triad of people, plants, and animals, and the environment happens to the other members of that triad as well. And One Health really is not anything new. It's been around for a very, very long time. But looking at this as being more sustainability for the planet and the well being of all elements of this planet. We only got one planet. We've only got one future. And I've got two cats, and one of them is up here already. Uh, so at Del Val, we've been doing this now for 10 years. And we've approached this from a few ways. One is from education. We do introduce the concept of One Health to our first time freshmen. They receive that within Del Val 2. It's also embedded in a whole slew of classes, and certainly mine, with as highly charged as I am about One Health, I certainly bring it into everything that I talk about. And for many students, they'll probably could tell you that when I say what is One Health about, and it actually is everything. Everything is about One Health. Every decision we make individually or as a community or globally has impacts. Research. It's something that at Del Val we have truly student research. Students have to come up with their own projects. We can mentor them, but really they go through all the processes themselves. Here's a challenge. I really would love to see students from multiple departments, at least two different departments, come together and develop a research program project that would be truly a One Health research project. The other component of One Health is listening and listening to people from different points of view. Some of the best decisions you'll ever make in your life will be when you actually talk to somebody else. Bounce off your ideas, listen to what they have to say. They've got expertise maybe that you don't have. And I got to tell you, this world requires multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches to answer the problems that face us. And then finally is outreach. And that's what these seminars are all about, outreach. These are open to the community and they are recorded and available at delval.edu/onehealth, one word, in what I hope is perpetuity. So tonight, I am so happy to have our speaker with us this evening, Dr. Julie Ellis, somebody I met, I believe, a year ago. And we were sitting side by side in a meeting, and we were challenged to introduce ourselves to each other. And both of us brought up the topic of One Health. Nobody else in the room brought up One Health, but we happened to be sitting right beside each other. So it was one of those moments when I was like, oh, a kindred spirit right here with us. Uh, I'm going to do my official introduction at this point, but again, I am so happy to have you with us, Dr. Ellis. So Julie Ellis is a wildlife ecologist who has over 20 years of experience leading wildlife health projects and programs in the Northeast U.S. Ellis co-founded the Wildlife Futures Program, a partnership between the School of Veterinary Medicine, University of Pennsylvania, PennVet, and the Pennsylvania Game Commission, aimed at strengthening the resilience of the Commonwealth's 480 species of birds and mammals through wildlife health surveillance, research, and outreach to inform wildlife management in Pennsylvania and beyond. We do actually communicate with other states. She holds a BS and an MS in systematics and ecology from the University of Kansas. Got a great museum. And a PhD in ecology, evolutionary biology from Brown University. Dr. Ellis, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate you all being here at 6 o'clock p.m. So thank you for that. I thought a bit about my topic tonight, and what I'm going to do actually is this talk will eventually tackle the title, like what's in the title. And now let me just share here. But I decided to do a little bit more of an intro to what's on the title because I thought it might be interesting, especially for an audience with a broad background. Okay, can you see my slides okay? Perfect. Okay, thank you for the very kind introduction. I am at the University of Pennsylvania at the School of Veterinary Medicine, and I am a wildlife ecologist by training. And I thought, given that many of you are undergraduates, I would just briefly go into my background just to show you that you never know exactly where you will end up in your career and that your career doesn't need to be a straight path to be successful. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Kansas, but I always wanted to be a marine biologist. So I ended up at Kansas doing a project on gulls off the coast of Washington, which led me to ultimately taking an underwater research class off the coast of Maine through the Shoals Marine Laboratory. Um, I then became a tern biologist for a summer on a tiny, tiny island up there in the far left-hand corner, White Island, which is off the coast of New Hampshire. And that picture of the terns, one is a real tern, two are wooden terns, but the real tern doesn't know the difference. So I spent the summer there basically attracting terns to the island where we wanted them to come and nest successfully, where they hadn't nested in a very long time. And then I ended up doing my PhD on subtidal ecology or intertidal ecology, basically food web dynamics. So looking at gulls of all things and how gulls influence marine food webs by eating a variety of marine invertebrates. So that was, and I grew up in Texas, so not really anywhere terribly near the ocean because I lived in North Texas, went to undergraduate in Kansas, and then ended up working, doing my PhD in the Gulf of Maine. And then I got to know some veterinarians, wildlife veterinarians in particular, and I ended up taking a job running a citizen science program at Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine. And I ran a whole program dedicated to investigating dead birds on the coast. Very, very glamorous and not. And that was great though, because we had wonderful volunteers who were very enthusiastic about documenting what they saw on these coastlines. And then that ended up leading to me working with colleagues to form a regional wildlife disease cooperative called the Northeast Wildlife Disease Cooperative. So nowhere even remotely where I thought I would be, particularly when I was at the University of Kansas as an undergraduate. But I'm very happy with, how things have gone. And I will tell you, I've also had, I've had failures and successes along the way, and those failures are just as important, if not more so, than the successes in terms of learning. Okay, that's my background. And then this is the outline for my talk today. And please do feel free to put questions in the chat. The only thing I don't like about doing virtual presentations is I love to interact with the audience. So don't be shy about putting in questions. So the outline today, I thought we would start a little broad with just talking about what is meant by wildlife health and health in general. How do we evaluate wildlife health? And then I will go to the title of my talk, the original title, which is Integrating Health into the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan. Okay, so, when you think about wildlife health, if you enter the term wildlife health or disease on the internet in a Google search, you can get a lot of websites that are kind of predominated by mentions of disease, wildlife disease, health concerns, health threats. Um, Particularly, that you find a lot of sites when it comes to bats and some other species that focus on how wildlife can make you sick. So you think about coronavirus, highly pathogenic avian influenza. So it's a little bit scary, actually, when you start looking up wildlife health and disease, what you find. It's a little bit daunting. And I would say that up to now and up till recent years, the One Health movement in some ways has exacerbated this negative focus by identifying wildlife as a major source of emerging infectious of public health concern. And so it's really promoted an intense line of research into wildlife pathogen detection. So thinking again about, how we define wildlife health, you can think about it too, or define it by sort of how it's implemented, like how do we do wildlife health? And there's a couple of main ways that you may have heard about. I don't know if anyone has been to their local wildlife rehabilitation clinic, but certainly that is one area of wildlife health, like clinical medicine, part of wildlife health that a lot of the public is familiar with. If you've seen an injured bird or mammal, you might have taken it to a clinic. And then the other way it's operationalized is through surveillance and diagnostics. So again, a focus on, all right, we found some sick or dead wildlife and trying to figure out, well, what caused the death? Is this something that's infectious? And then what are the implications of that pathogen? And then this is, I apologize for the gross photo. You can avert your eyes if you want, but this is how I, as a wildlife ecologist, got kind of roped into this whole area of health when I started to meet wildlife veterinarians in the context of mass mortality events of sea ducks in Massachusetts. And so for several of my early years in wildlife health, I really was kind of just studying like dead stuff. So, trying to figure out why things are dying. If it's of interest to any of you, the picture in the middle with the little orange things, those are so-called thorny headed worms that are parasites of common eiders, if you were wondering what that was. So traditionally, wildlife health surveillance has really focused on detecting early warning signals, for risks of zoonotic disease. And zoonotic diseases are ones that can be shared and typically are defined as ones that are transmitted from animals to people. So diseases that can spill over to humans or livestock. And the focus has also been on tracking specific infectious diseases that do, concern wildlife conservation to a certain extent. And this means that historically, the field has been framed through kind of a disease-focused lens. How do we identify and manage pathology and dysfunction? And even the name of the leading professional organization is the Wildlife Disease Association, and that kind of reflects that emphasis. Interestingly, at this year's conference, it was noted that there needs to be a name change and that we need to be thinking more proactively about, promoting health of wildlife in addition to investigating disease and mortality. Um, so the other problem with emphasizing pathogens is we end up framing health in terms of failure, sort of like focusing on what's wrong instead of what's working. And this approach can keep us reactive and constantly diagnosing causes rather than asking what allows a population to stay healthy, productive, and resilient in the first place. All right, so when we think about definitions of health, we can turn to the field of human health. which has been around a lot longer actually than, or at least the organized human health groups have been around for much longer than the Wildlife Disease Association. And if you go to the World Health Organization's website, you look at the definition for human health, its health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, sorry for the dog, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in human health, it's recognized that health is complicated and it's not just defined by an animal or in this case, a human being free of disease or infirmity. It's more than that. So what we are doing in wildlife health is redefining or modernizing the definition of wildlife health. Hey, Ruby, can you get Buddy outside? Sorry, my kid's trying to get the dog to stop barking. So defining health solely as the absence of disease is outdated. It lags around 70 years behind the modern human health concepts. So when we talk about health, it's really important to remember that it's not just a biological condition, it's the result of many interacting factors. So health comes from biological, social, and environmental determinants that shape an organism's ability to cope with change over time. In other words, health isn't simply about what's absence, it's about positive characteristics of animals and ecosystems as well. So for example, a population might face exposure to pathogens or habitat stress, but if it has strong genetic diversity, sufficient food resources, and a stable environment, it could still be considered healthy. And this leads to an even more interesting idea that wildlife health isn't just purely a biological state, it's a social construct. How we define healthy wildlife also depends on human perspectives and expectations and our scientific understanding. What we consider a healthy population also can reflect our values, such as whether we expect certain species to persist, maintain ecological balance, or avoid transmitting diseases to humans or livestock. So when we assess wildlife health, we're not just measuring biology, we're also reflecting our own cultural, ethical, and scientific lenses through which we view the natural world. The determinants of health may be a concept that you've heard about. It's one that comes from the realm of public health. And the first model describing the determinants of health came out in 1991, published by Dahlgren and Whitehead. And it's now called the Rainbow Model of Health. And this framework shows how health is influenced by multiple layers, from individual biology to the wider social and environmental context. The model illustrates that health isn't determined only by genes or lifestyle, it's shaped by where we live, the air we breathe, our income, education, jobs, and the policies that structure our lives. These influences interact too, like the layers of the rainbow, to either support or to undermine our well-being. So these influences are complex and multidimensional. And when you think about sort of the categories of these determinants of health, you could think of social and economic factors like income, education, employment. Whether you have a strong social support network, you may have heard there's been a lot of information in the past couple of years in the news about how as you age, it's very important to have that social support network, very important for your mental and physical health. Also, your physical environment is important. Access to clean air, safe housing, green space, reliable infrastructure, food, and then your individual factors like genetics, personal behavior, what's your diet, your activity, do you smoke, access to healthcare, all of those things still play a role, but they're kind of embedded within this broader social context. So this rainbow model really helped shift attention from just treating illness to promoting health for humans. It highlighted that preventing disease often means improving living conditions, not just providing medical care. It also reframed responsibility for health. Good health depends not only on healthcare workers, but also on teachers, employers, urban planners, and policymakers who shape the environments where people live. So this rainbow model still influences modern health policy and global health initiatives. And it reminds us that improving health requires collaboration, what Reg referred to as transdisciplinarity. It requires all sorts of collaboration across disciplines and sectors in order to understand the causes and the solutions for human well-being. And then finally, wrapping this back up and applying it to wildlife, recent paper came out in 2019, and this is being explored further now, that attempted to apply this concept of determinants of health to wildlife, trying to get us to think more holistically about what shapes the health of animal populations and ecosystems. So again, instead of focusing only on diseases or pathology, this approach considers the full range of factors, the abiotic environment like climate and habitat quality, biotic factors like species interactions and biodiversity, and social or human influences like land use, management practices, and community behavior or policies. So in public health, this model shifted thinking from treating disease to understanding and strengthening conditions that keep populations healthy. The same logic is being now applied to wildlife. So that rather than like waiting for an outbreak to occur, we can invest in building resilience, maintaining ecosystem integrity, and supporting the natural processes that promote health. The other thing that's nice about this model is just like in human health, it also highlights opportunities for collaboration among scientists, veterinarians, land managers, state wildlife agencies, and communities, as well as policy actions. So ultimately, this perspective views health as the cumulative outcome of many interacting determinants, and that involves a broad variety of collaborations and expertise. And then finally, we'll go to one more concept from human health that is now being applied to wildlife. And this idea is how can we, so this is what's called the continuum of care model. It's a familiar concept in medical care, like hospital care, and it's applied through insurance as well. So the idea here is on the left side of the continuum, you have what's more health promotion, that's proactive. And then on the far right side, you have very reactive or where you're kind of promoting recovery from something that's happened. So health promotion can mean supporting conditions like habitat that allows animals and ecosystems to thrive. Risk prevention involves using tools like disease risk analysis to identify potential hazards and assess their likelihood and impact. Risk reduction is where surveillance and monitoring come in, and early detection is important. We can quickly contain outbreaks and limit their scale. Early intervention focuses on minimizing progression of harm once a problem arises. That might mean isolating affected areas or containing the spread of a disease. And then recovery emphasizes learning and adaptation. So after like a mortality or adverse event, we work to restore populations and ecosystems. So overall, applying this continuum of care to wildlife health shifts our mindset from reacting to crises towards maintaining health and resilience over time. Okay, so that's kind of the broad conceptual background to what we're going to be discussing a little bit today, which is what is health? How do we define it? Um, these are sort of early days in these discussions because maybe you might be able to imagine that, investigating a disease outbreak or a mass mortality event is kind of straightforward. You run diagnostics, you test for diseases. It doesn't mean you always come up with an answer, but it's relatively straightforward. But how do you evaluate when wildlife are healthy? That's much more challenging. And we're sort of in the early days of our thinking on that. So here's where I would love for you to think about, like, what do you think are measurable indicators? What would be measurable indicators of wildlife health? And you could think of like a deer herd or raccoons or whatever it is that pops into your head when you think about wildlife. What would, in your mind be measurable indicators of health? So some of the things, and I wonder how these align with what popped into your head, some of the things that we think about are genetic diversity of a wildlife population, immune function, and that's affected by all sorts of things like physiological stress, for example, reproductive fitness of individual animals. That means like how many offspring can an individual produce in its lifetime? Population parameters like birth rate, mortality rate, body condition, organ function, whether or not the animals have active infections, what their parasite loads are, and then looking at causes of morbidity and mortality. You might also be able to think of other measurable indicators of wildlife health, and lots of people are trying to do that at this point, particularly trying to find ones that are easy to measure. So this is kind of a neat paper that came out relatively recently in 2023 in Nature Portfolio, which is kind of cool because it's an unusual paper in that it really does try to explore multi-indicators for wildlife health applied to an endangered caribou herd. So in this case, the study tackled the challenge of evaluating wildlife health in one of the world's most remote and changing environments, the Arctic. Researchers focused on an endangered tundra caribou population, developing a multifaceted approach and a novel wildlife health framework to better understand what's driving changes in their health and numbers. Over the past 2 decades, whoops, I'm going to go back here. Over the past 2 decades, many caribou herds have experienced dramatic declines across the Arctic, but the reasons have remained unclear. Scientists suspect a combination of factors like nutrition, disease, and parasites, but the way these elements interact with each other and with environmental change are poorly understood. So traditionally, wildlife managers rely on demographic indicators like what I described in the previous slide: population size, birth rates of a population, how many offspring are produced by the population, and then survival of those offspring as well as adults. And that's how herd population status is tracked by wildlife managers. But those numbers don't always explain why populations rise or fall. They're the consequence of or a symptom of what might be affecting the population. So to fill that gap, this study integrated health investigations with those demographic characters. So looking at body condition, parasite loads, disease exposure, and nutritional status, in addition to the demographic indicators to connect the dots between health metrics and population trends. So identifying drivers of health and demographic change. They wanted to better anticipate threats and to figure out what they wanted to pinpoint the causes of the population decline so that they could then come and help stabilize or recover these populations. So the authors recognized all of these, or identified these different health outcomes, health processes, and health determinants. So these are what they called health indices. And so they included things like pregnancy rate, body condition, survival. So those are all sort of the demographic indices that you might measure as an indicator of whether or not a population's doing well. And then some of the health processes like fecal cortisol, which is or hair cortisol, it's a measure of physiological stress, lesions, which are just abnormal infections typically, or trauma in animals that are described typically by veterinary pathologists and veterinarians, parasite loads, viruses, the antibody responses to viruses and known pathogens that affect caribou, and then trace minerals that gets at sort of the nutritional status of the animals. And what the authors figured out by combining all of these health outcomes as well as health determinants and putting them together in the same model is that the factors that really were driving population decline and that were impacting the animal's abilities to cope with stressors and maintain functions were body condition and pregnancy rates. So the findings suggested that body condition and pregnancy rates of these animals were actually not the main drivers of the herd's sharp decline, and that instead the decline was more likely linked to determinants affecting adult and calf survival. So these results were consistent across historical harvest data and indigenous knowledge, which they incorporated into the study. So it was in the end, lower survival and not poor condition, which was the critical factor in shaping, or the part of the population essentially, in the aspect of the population that was shaping the decline. And they also figured out that there were potential contributors, including infectious diseases like brucella, trace mineral deficiencies, and possibly extreme climatic events. So overall, by combining and kind of applying a determinants of health framework, it moved them forward into a more specific and conceptual understanding of what was driving these population declines and which element of the populations were most heavily affected. And so in the next studies, they will be trying to figure out how then they could mitigate the impacts on those aspects of the population and those components of the population. Okay, so the last section of my talk is going to get to this idea of integrating health into the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan, which is the title of my talk. And what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about this specific project that we worked on with the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. So I'll talk a little bit about that specific project, but then I'm going to tie it back to some of the concepts like determinants of health and some of the concepts more broadly that I touched on at the beginning of the presentation. So what I first want to talk about, because I don't know if everybody knows this, I'm not sure if everybody knows sort of who's got regulatory authority and who's responsible for maintaining the health of free-ranging wildlife. So just to do a very brief history on wildlife management and conservation in North America, in the early days of the formation of our nation, there were very few laws to protect fish and wildlife. And as a result, natural resources were heavily overused. So what happened is market hunters could take fish and animals whenever they wanted, and habitat disappeared as forests were cleared for farms, roads, and towns. And some of the results of this habitat change and hunting was that some species, like the passenger pigeon, which is in this image here, believe it or not, flocks of passenger pigeons used to be so large that they were like the size of clouds passing overhead. So some species, like the passenger pigeon, were hunted to extinction during this time. And then others, like bison, white-tailed deer, and wild turkeys, were pushed to the brink of extinction, surviving only in small, fragile populations. It's kind of hard to imagine that nowadays, considering how many white-tailed deer and turkeys that you see these days. So by the early 1900s, overhunting and habitat loss had devastated wildlife across North America. In response, citizens, scientists, and policymakers built a new system, now called the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. And this still guides how we manage and protect wildlife today. The core principles of the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation really rest on two key ideas. One is that wildlife belongs to the public. It's a shared resource, not private property. And that wildlife should be managed sustainably so it remains available for future generations. These ideas are further reflected in several core pillars of the North American model that shape how state and federal agencies work. So a couple of those pillars are allocation by law, which means that state agencies set the rules for hunting seasons, bag limits, and permit systems. And that's to ensure fair and democratic and sustainable use of wildlife resources, and then legitimate use, where wildlife can only be taken for valid purposes, such as food, fur, self-defense, property protection, or for wildlife management, not for waste or commercial gain. And then finally, science-based management is key. So wildlife decisions rely on scientific data, not politics, to maintain healthy and sustainable populations. So the takeaway was that the North American model links law, science, and public responsibility, ensuring that wildlife remains a shared legacy for generations to come. So as a result of this and further legislation, State wildlife action plans, or SWAPs, exist for all 50 states in the United States, and they're essentially the nation's blueprints for proactively protecting fish and wildlife. The idea of the state wildlife action plans is that instead of waiting for species to become endangered, these plans aim to prevent declines before it's too late. The first plans were drafted in 2005. So every state, territory, and the District of Columbia submitted its first state wildlife action plan to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this submission was a requirement to receive federal funding through the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program, and that's still the case. The scope and purpose of the plans is to identify species of greatest conservation need, or SGCNs, which include federally and state listed threatened and endangered species, as well as rare or declining species that aren't yet listed. And the SWAPs describe important habitats for these species, key threats they face, conservation actions needed, research and monitoring. They also require collaboration and public involvement. Public input is required. The plans are developed with scientists, conservation organizations, and interested members of the public. The plans undergo a major review and revision at least every 10 years, and every state now is in the process of completing their second major review, due in 2025. So this next plan for Pennsylvania and all other states will go from 2025 to 2035. So we were really lucky that the Wildlife Futures Program, which was first founded in 2019, was able to provide support for this revision in 2025. So the last couple of years, we worked really closely with Game Commission and Fish and Boat, and with our team of wildlife veterinarians and other staff and faculty to integrate health threats throughout Pennsylvania's revised plan for the next 10 years. So we worked closely with the agencies to define the scope of work, which included identifying priority health threats, determining passive and active wildlife health surveillance priorities based upon those health threats, and identifying management strategies that may mitigate species impacts and geographic spread of a priority threat after it is detected in Pennsylvania. We further, and this took us a little while, defined the scope of work. And by that, I mean, how are we going to define health threat in the context of this project? We went back and forth a lot about that. And what was decided is that because we have the health and veterinary expertise and ecological expertise focused on health, that really for this section of the Wildlife Action Plan, we would define health in the context of threats. So organisms, so viruses, fungi, bacteria, parasites, toxins, chemical pollutants that cause disease in wildlife. We also could include exposure to extreme weather events and heat caused by climate change if there were documented impacts on health of Pennsylvania wildlife. Our approach was to do a multi-state questionnaire and in-person interviews with other veterinarians, other state agency species biologists. We did with students at Penn Vet and broader Penn an extensive literature review and synthesis. And then in the end, we had our veterinarians as well as the Game Commission veterinarian and the agency species biologist review our priorities and help us prioritize those health threats based on all of the information that we accumulated. So we did this for over 200 species, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, and freshwater mussels. This is what one of our deliverables looked like. So we created a 10-page report, updated the species accounts throughout the Wildlife Action Plan with health threats specific to every single species. And then we also, in the appendices, included very, very detailed information. So what you're seeing here is for some of the amphibians, what some of the main threats are. So categories of threats: fungal pathogens, viral pathogens, the specific threat, and then potential management actions and research needs. So that was done for every species. The appendices contain all these details, whereas the updated species accounts only include the top priority threats. And what we mainly found was a variety of threats. So for birds, the main threats to birds were high exposure to pesticides, heavy metals, and viruses like West Nile virus and highly pathogenic avian influenza. Mammals had a slightly different suite of risks, including viral infections, exposure to industrial pollutants, particularly for small mammals like voles and shrews. And then there are some small mammals and bat species that are particularly concerning because they don't have very much health data. So it's hard to evaluate trends for them. And then for amphibians and reptiles, fungal and viral diseases are key drivers of decline. Chytridiomycosis, which you may have heard of, chytrid disease in frogs and salamanders, and snake fungal disease cause high mortality and are concerns, as is ranavirus. And then again, contaminants in aquatic and terrestrial systems like pesticides and mercury are a threat to those groups. And then fish and mollusks, so freshwater mussels, many of which are already declining, but they remain understudied. And for those two groups, fish and freshwater mussels in particular, wastewater pollution is a priority health concern. So overall, the threats we identified in Pennsylvania really sit at the intersection of pollution, disease, and data deficiency. So what we need is more comprehensive monitoring and proactive health strategies to protect these species in greatest conservation need. This, I'm not going to go, actually, Reg, I should just give you my presentation as a PDF if you're interested in having that, but I don't have time to go into details here. But
Absolutely.
yeah, just to give you an idea of sort of what the recommended management outcomes, because I want to leave a little time for questions here. So some of the recommended management actions, if you look at this, so instead of looking this categorized by species group, this slide is categorized by threats. So there's contaminants here. So some of the management actions were, and management actions can also include research recommendations and surveillance recommendations. So for contaminants, we know a bit about the existence or occurrence of contaminants in some of these species. We know they're there, but we really don't know a whole lot on what the impacts are on populations of these animals. So how are these concentrations of contaminants in their tissues affecting reproduction, longevity, and some of those demographic indices that I talked about with the caribou? How are they affecting the populations of all of these species? For fungal and viral pathogens, we need more active and passive surveillance for those to figure out distribution of where those are and maybe where spatially the risks for those are highest. Again, evaluating their effects, identifying sources of these infections to maybe mitigate or halt the spread, and then rapid diagnostics. For novel or emerging threats, we need disease risk assessments and active surveillance, as well as rapid response plans. And again, rapid diagnostic tools. For viral pathogens, there's some effort to develop vaccinations. This is a little hard with free-ranging wildlife, but when you have smaller populations, like with these SGCNs, I know out in Washington State, there is vaccination now for a threatened species of rabbit for a rabbit hemorrhagic disease. That's a big threat to rabbits. So it's a relatively small population and they can vaccinate a lot of those animals. So it's pretty effective there. A little harder to do when you have a widespread population, but that is something that's being worked on for some of these pathogens. And then for parasites, we just don't know a whole lot about them. So we need some surveillance there. And then a lot can be done just through fundamental biosecurity. So that means like when you're a biologist in the field, particularly if you're studying aquatic and terrestrial habitats and terrestrial and aquatic species, to disinfect your gear and your equipment and your boots when you go from habitat to habitat, just to make sure you're not involved in spreading pathogens. And then also screening for pathogens before animals are moved from one place to the next. And then really some key knowledge gaps, and we'll wrap up, is that there's really a scarcity of information on health overall, particularly for these species of greatest conservation need, because they typically do have small population sizes. Some of the animals are hard to find. They're small, like shrews. They might be cryptic. So it is hard to get information about them. And so there has been some interest now in maybe using eDNA to at least sample habitats for pathogens, also to sample habitats for the species. Some people have talked about using closely related but more abundant species that are kind of surrogates in that same habitat as the SGCNs. Use those closely related species as an indicator of what threats might exist in a shared habitat. And then also biobanking as much as you can, especially when there's no current money existing for testing and surveillance. There's not much. If those of you, any of you are interested in wildlife health, there's a lot of areas to go into here. Like, what is the impact of climate change? We really don't know much, except a little bit on impacts on vectors like mosquitoes and ticks. But what's the direct effect on health of these animals? We don't know a lot. Um, and there's also a lot of interest. I talked a lot in the beginning of this lecture on promoting health and resilience, but then here I'm talking about everything's sick and how do we do surveillance for diseases, right? So there is a lot of interest, and we actually put it in the Wildlife Action Plan in establishing and evaluating health metrics. How can we work with these amazing state wildlife biologists? These species biologists at the agencies are incredible. They are a font of knowledge about the species that they manage. How can we begin to work with them, combining our health, veterinary expertise, virology expertise, et cetera, to put together a more integrated approach and proactive approach to wildlife health in Pennsylvania? So that's something that we are all interested in doing. And then I just want to quickly acknowledge the folks that put in a lot of work at the last few slides, and this Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan project were Dr. Scott Larson, Sabrina Greening, Erica Miller, Kevin Niedringhaus, and Christy Jacobus with the Wildlife Futures Program. Kathy Hafner, Andrew DeSalvo at Game Commission, Diana Day at Fish and Boat, some amazing students that did a massive amount of literature reviews, and then all the survey and questionnaire responders, in addition to the Richard King Mellon Foundation, and that is it. Hopefully we have time for questions.
Yes, we do. We've got a few minutes for questions. And boy, Julie, I want to thank you so much because you've really helped update my view of wildlife disease. And something that I'm always telling my students is, you know, as I was coming up, the measure of health was, is it alive or dead?
Yeah, well, like it still is to a certain extent.
And that, we would see disease, but it was like, gee, I wonder what that is and whether they'll survive it. Uh,
Yep. Yep.
there was that was about as far as we got with this. I love the rainbow model. I think the rainbow model uh, really is expanding how we think about this, and it also makes it so much more complicated, doesn't it? Well,
It does.
trying to pull all of this information together. We've got a couple of questions coming up, and I would invite everyone else to please put your questions into Q&A. So I'll go with anonymous first here. How does avian influenza or mange fit into all of this?
Oh my goodness. Avian influenza is so challenging because it's affecting not only poultry, as I'm sure you've heard about, dairy cows now, potentially people, right? But it's also impacting our native wildlife. It can cause mortality in a variety of wild birds in Pennsylvania and in the region, and then some of our native mammals as well, like foxes. So avian influenza, a hard one. I mean, it is truly a one health threat because boy, it affects everything, particularly now. So I think we have some really incredible, at Penn Vet actually, Louise, Moncla and a couple of folks from Penn Med are working, and then our own diagnostic lab, Lisa Murphy, and other folks at Wildlife Futures are trying to put together like a holistic plan for dealing with avian influenza. Can we vaccinate poultry? Can we, what can we do here to manage this disease? But that's a tough one, and everybody's working on it and concerned about it right now. Um, and then mange is one that's um, does tend to be more wildlife. That's one I think a lot of people see it, are likely, at least the public's likely to see it like in foxes. You can sometimes see a fox with mange in the wild. Um, And that one's also a little hard because it's treatable, but then it's sort of hard to figure out, you know, at what point is it okay to treat free-ranging wildlife for these diseases? You know, at what point is mange sort of at what threshold is mange sort of just a natural part? Because there are diseases that occur in wildlife, right? Just like in humans. And with wildlife, some diseases are just part of the natural life history of that population, right? But the question is, if mange becomes so prevalent that it's really impacting the whole population, then at a certain point you may have to look into interventions and what those look like. I think are up to the agencies to figure out how to deal with that, as well as the researchers who are working on it. But that's also a tricky one, but one that's maybe a little bit easier than avian influenza, which is so broadly impactful. Um, so have you ever done anything with any sort of reptile research? And my second question is your job fun to have? Well, those are great questions. Um, I personally haven't done reptile research, but I love turtles. And turtles and amphibians kind of get the short shrift in a lot of ways, in terms of management. And part of it's because they're not hunted. So there's not like revenue from hunting that you could use to fund conservation and management for those species, but they're really important for so many reasons. They're great environmental indicators, like sentinel species for the health of the environment. Um, and they're just really cool animals because they're so different than us. And then yes, my job is fun to have. Um, yeah, thank you for asking for that. I actually feel very fortunate that I was the kid that grew up watching National Geographic and Jacques Cousteau. And I always have loved wildlife, so I just feel very, very fortunate to be able to make my little contribution in my little area of helping wildlife. So yes. Yes, PA has Wildlife Futures Program actually works very closely with Game Commission. Chronic wasting disease is a big disease of concern and management. So yes, there's a response plan for chronic wasting disease that's housed at the Game Commission. I believe it's even available if you go to the chronic wasting disease webpage for the Game Commission. You could check that out. Wildlife Futures Program is helping quite a bit with testing for diagnostics for that disease, but also doing some really amazing research trying to figure out better diagnostic assays, quicker turnaround times for test results, and then also trying to figure out how to stem the spread of that disease. So lots of work being done there.
And if you don't go to the Game Commission site, any of you students who are looking for that CWD action plan, I have a copy of it too. I'd be happy
Perfect.
to provide that.
That would be great. It's actually a nice example of what does that look like? Like, what's a disease
Yeah,
response plan look like?
yeah.
Um, okay. What should we do if we see wildlife covered in ticks? Oh man, I saw a deer with her entire neck and face covered. Do we let nature take its course or should we call someone? With the ticks, we typically let nature take its course. I know that's hard because it's not fun to see these deer covered. Hi, Maddie, I see you. And actually, Maddie,
Hi, Maddie.
the reason I'm calling on her, Sarah, for your question is Maddie works with the Wildlife Futures Program and is an alum of Del Val, and she is actually quite involved in our diagnostics and a lot of the necropsies of the wildlife that we get with at Penn Vet with the Wildlife Futures Program. Um, so typically, yeah, if an animal's covered in ticks, we usually let nature take its course. Um, yeah, and the deer in particular, we know deer populations are big and quite robust in Pennsylvania, so it wouldn't really be like a management or conservation concern in that case. But thank you for that question. Maddie, what were some surprising findings during your time putting together the Wildlife Action Plan? Um, I would say that one of them was how many fish and freshwater mussel species are in Pennsylvania. I did not know we're like a hotbed for freshwater mussel diversity, mostly out in the Allegheny area. I didn't know that, and I also didn't realize how many data gaps were there, for health for and just in general for those species. There's so little known and so much to do in those with those species. I think it's pretty cool, a neat area for future research. And then also, I was a little surprised by how little data there is on extreme weather and climate. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised because it's still relatively new, doing that research, because you have to let the research on, extreme weather and climate change. It can take time, right, to get results for that. That's kind of a long-term investment in terms of a research project. But I was surprised at, how little we know about direct impacts of extreme weather and climate change on wildlife. Another interesting area to go into if anybody's interested. And is there a specific species you are hoping that gets the attention they need with this new plan? Um, boy, species, a specific species, no, but groups of species, I would say again, and this is just kind of my bias, I always like to root for the underdog, and I feel like, the amphibians, some of the invertebrates, I feel like really kind of are the underdogs in some ways. There's just not as much funding, and it's really hard. They're not as charismatic in a lot of ways. It's like, yay, a toad. When when you're faced with like really cool, like a flashy mammal or a cool endangered bird, somehow it's less appealing to like rally people behind a warty toad, but or a frog, but they're really important to the ecosystem. So I guess it would be those amphibians and invertebrates. Maddie, is there anything you want, not to put you on the spot, was there any one thing you wanted to chime in on diseases and diagnostics and kind of your perspective on wildlife health at all in our last couple of minutes?
The only way she can answer is through the Q&A.
Oh, she can only chat. Okay.
Yeah, she won't be able to actually speak.
Oh, I see. Okay, there's more questions here. My dad worked for the, yay! My dad worked for the PA Game Commission for 30 years. Amazing. That's fabulous. Yeah, the biologists there are really phenomenal. How or does the Futures Program and the overall wildlife health program approach wildlife as reservoirs of human diseases? Um, yeah, George, I mean, so because we are supported by the Game Commission and we are really focused on wildlife management and health. And part of the reason for that is we are supported um, primarily by wildlife agencies, right? So we have a strategic plan with the game, so we're really trying to like make sure that we, you know, provide Game Commission and these agencies with health information and diagnostics and research that's valuable for managing wildlife specifically. Um, but, we can get our own funding and do some work on, looking at zoonoses or diseases that can be spread from wildlife to humans or domestic species. It's just not really the focus of our particular program. Um, but, if we find results that have implications for human health, we certainly would communicate that out to relevant, other groups where that's the priority. So it's not to say we ignore those things, if that makes sense. It's just not the main focus of the program. Not a question, but wanted to add that endangered amphibians deserve way more love. I agree. Oh my gosh, I love hellbenders. They're adorable. They really are. Silly and flat. Oh, they're cute. Um, oh, contingency plans in case of an outbreak. Oh, I see. You're following up on your yeah, actually, one way, yes. Okay, so one way we are tackling that is our program, I think it was last year, did a tabletop exercise where, yes, we did have sort of a scenario where we pulled together um, Pima, um, We had people there that were representing public health, Department of Public Health, Game Commission, so like the Wildlife Agency, Wildlife Futures, like sort of university researchers, all pulled together to figure out and to deal with like a tabletop scenario that involved a zoonotic disease outbreak originating from deer. Actually, that was not a real scenario, but a fake one. And yes, so that was the first step. That tabletop was the first step in figuring out, okay, so if we do find something that is infectious to humans in wildlife, what will we do? How can we work with these other agencies that are in charge of, like, their jurisdiction is human health? How can we work with them to then help to, come up with a plan for response? And that, I believe that tabletop will be followed up on by Lisa Murphy, and some other folks are running that again, I think, this year. So sorry, I forgot to mention that at the beginning, but yes, that's how we're dealing with it. That's a great question. Okay, we are at
Well,
10:01.
yeah, we are at time. I would like to end up with a request of everyone. Uh, if you think that this kind of work is important, if you think that the many different areas that actually benefit the well-being of not only just species, but also of communities and of ecosystems, one, please contact your representatives and ask them to fund the state wildlife action or the state wildlife and tribal grant funding at the highest level possible. That's one. Second, if you haven't heard of it, look up Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It has not yet come back to be before the Senate and House again, but it will need support. That would provide consistent funding for these species of greatest conservation need in states across the country, in tribal areas across the country at much higher levels. And clearly, all of these synergistic impacts that Dr. Ellis has talked about here that are impacting species require a whole different scale of research than we've ever done before. And I hope you agree with that, Dr. Ellison.
Those were really, really good concrete ideas for things people could do to protect wildlife, for sure. Really good suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. And thanks all of you for joining us tonight. I hope you'll join us for our last two One Health seminars, but also keep in mind that the first week of November is One Health Week at Del Val. We will have a bunch of activities available. Different clubs will be doing a club challenge. We will have a milkshake social. We have one of our speakers that week. It's a good time to just sit back and say, I am so happy that I'm aware of One Health and to make a One Health pledge. Thank you all.
That's
Thank you,
great.
Dr. Ellis.
I wish I could go. That sounds fun.
You can come.
Awesome.
Just skip off from work and come out. We'd love to have
Sure.
you.
All right. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye-bye.